A deed, no matter what kind or how big, sometimes can be significant enough to change the course of history. Today we've compiled a list of such events from ages ago that, although were tiny, shaped the major chunks of modern history. Hit that subscribe button to stay connected. So, grab a seat and prepare for a wild ride through the weirdest truths out there. Let's jump right in. Joseph Stalin's paranoia caused him death. The death of this Stalin attracted several conspiracy theories, one of which talks about his strong fear of getting assassinated. His security team, too, was forbidden from entering his room without permission, so much so that when one day he didn't come out from his room to carry on with his routine, the guards didn't muster the courage to step in and find out why, because if they entered without permission, they would have been executed. But if Stalin was in fact in a state of emergency, and the guards had stayed out, that too would have made them face the same fate. They feared the dictator immensely, even when they found him helpless inside his room, and the doctors that came to his aid examined him with trembling hands. 4 days post the incident, the dictator was dead, allegedly of a major stroke. The Berlin Wall came down because a bureaucrat didn't read his speech properly. The momentous event wasn't a conscious decision, but a bureaucratic accident, kind of comical in nature. East Germany had decided to loosen up the travel restrictions. Günter Schabowski, an East Germany politician, was given the charge of bringing the relaxed rules into the information of people of Germany by holding a press conference. On November 9th, 1989, Schabowski was given a piece of paper that he didn't care to read before stepping up the podium. The speech was long and boring, but everyone was at once alerted when he started to talk about relaxation in travel rules between the borders. Some reporters, after waking up from a long fish snooze, thought Schabowski was saying that the travel rules are being dropped completely. So, when some of them asked, "When does that go into force?" Schabowski started to flip pages to find the answer. On realizing that he was making a fool of himself standing before the media unprepared with what he has to convey, he muttered, "Immediately. Right away." The press got to business soon after, and the news that glorified East Germany's decision to take down the Berlin Wall right away fueled up. Soon, the frenzy at the Berlin Wall had reached to the limit, and to keep the situation curbed from going disastrous, military stayed back and the wall came down. A wrong turn of the carriage led to Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination, which led to World War I. While it is a well-known fact that the spark that lit the fire of World War I was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, perhaps not many know of the goof-up that led to his assassination and murder of the world at large. On a fateful day, 2 assassination attempts were directed at the Archduke, and in both of them, his chauffeur's role was pivotal. The first attempt failed, thanks to his chauffeur's success at deflecting the bomb that the assassins had thrown at the Archduke's carriage. The explosion claimed numerous lives, but the Archduke and the Duchess were saved. The Duke later on expressed his desire to meet the victims, and while on the way to the hospital, a wrong turn taken by the chauffeur changed the course of history. The turn led them straight towards one of the assassins, Gavrilo Princip, who had been hiding in a coffee shop when he saw the car approaching. Princip fired 2 shots. The Duke and the Duchess dropped dead. World War I set off. Erwin Rommel goes home on the wrong day. Erwin Rommel was commanded by Adolf Hitler to defend the coast of France. However, the badass field marshal was convinced that an invasion by the enemy troops was still way off, considering the weeks of bad weather. That went without any enemy activity. So, the marshal flew home to celebrate his wife's birthday. The other commanding officers were also convinced that the weather wouldn't allow any invasion, and so they too left to participate in training exercises. On June 6, 1944, the same day as her wife's birthday, the invasion took place, and by the time Rommel was back, all 5 beaches were captured by the Allied forces. Now, while this was the first goof-up, the second followed soon after, although we can't thank Hitler enough for this one. The German forces thought that releasing panzer tanks would have turned the battle in their favor, and so they called up Hitler to take his permission. But the evil dictator was sleeping, and how could anyone wake a Hitler's up from his sleep? The D-Day played a pivotal role in ending Hitler's regime. Sinking of Titanic could have been prevented if it weren't for a missing key. To date, there have cropped many theories on how the gigantic vessel sank, but the real key lies with those drowned with it. However, one of such many theories involves one of the few crew members who managed to survive the deadliest commercial peacetime maritime disasters. Fred Fleet was in charge of looking for the icebergs. However, he didn't have access to the binoculars, as they were locked up, and the key didn't make the journey. Fleet even testified to the Senate that if he had the access, he could have seen the impending disaster well in advance to prevent it. Before the ship set sail, the company made a sudden decision of replacing the second officer of the ship, David Blair, with Charles Lightoller, and the key to the locker stayed in the pocket of Blair, who had forgotten to hand it over as the ship got going. Thou shalt commit adultery. The phrase from the Wicked Bible had a missing crucial knot. The Wicked Bible, also called Adulterous Bible or Sinner's Bible, is the Bible published by the royal printers from London, Robert Barker and Martin Lucas in 1631. The Bible was originally meant to be a reprint of the King James Bible, but it became infamous as the Wicked Bible following a silly mistake turned epic. In the Ten Commandments, Exodus 20:14, because of a mistake from the printer's end, the word not in the sentence, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," was omitted. A year following the blunder, the printers were fined heavily and were deprived of their publishing license. The majority of the copies were, with an immediate effect, cancelled and burned. Mars Climate Orbiter disappeared and later disintegrated on Mars because the ground-based computer software worked by the imperial system instead of the metric system. On September 23, 1999, NASA lost communication with the spacecraft as it went closer into orbital insertion. This was a result of the computer software that produced the output in pound-seconds instead of the metric units of Newton-seconds. The same was even specified in the contract between NASA and Lockheed Martin, American Global Aerospace, the company which built the jet threshers. The discrepancy wasn't reported to the agency, and this caused the spacecraft to come in close proximity of the planet. It went through its upper atmosphere and consequently disintegrated. Dutch traders aren't impressed with Australia. Leave it for the British. In 1770, James Cook claimed Australia for Britain, and we all know how well that worked out for everyone living there. He wasn't the first European to set foot on the continent, though, and if it wasn't for a stupid lack of foresight, Australia might have been a Dutch colony. According to the National Museum of Australia, Dutch explorer Willem Janszoon was actually the first European to make recorded, official contact with Australia. He landed there in 1606 on a ship that was part of the Dutch East India Company. Having spent some time along the company's trade routes in Asia, he was dispatched on a mission to explore a largely unknown southern landmass to see if the Dutch might be able to harvest any gold or resources there. There weren't, but there were some understandably hostile native peoples that made them think twice about the whole endeavor. Susan Broomhall, history professor at the University of Western Australia, says not everyone thought it was a worthless piece of land. Some argued for using Australia as a stepping stone sort of colony along the Europe-Asia trade routes, and others said it was pretty much perfect for winemaking. Dutch East India Company officials weren't convinced, decided it wasn't worth the bother, and left the entire continent up for grabs. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button so you make sure to never miss our videos. A theater underestimates how much kids want free stuff. Even if you don't have kids, you know that kids like toys, right? In fact, it's safe to say that kids love toys, and if you think that's a given, it wasn't for event organizers at England's Victoria Hall, circa 1883. The Smithsonian says the Victoria Hall disaster was one of the most devastating events in Victorian-era Britain, and it was completely avoidable. It started simply enough, with a variety show that packed the theater with around 1,000 children. Shouting out the promise of free toys to a group of children who didn't have many toys is the very definition of the word mistake, and the kids surged forward as soon as the announcement was made. They left their seats, packed aisles, blocked staircases, and were crushed against doors. By the time the chaos cleared, 183 children were dead. That tragedy led to an invention you use all the time: the push-bar emergency exit. It took years for it to be installed in buildings around the world, and other similar tragedies would happen in the meantime, But those 183 children ultimately helped save the lives of countless others. Typos give women the right to vote in Kuwait. In 1999, CNN reported that the Kuwaiti cabinet ruled to allow women to vote. Why? Because of typos in the Quran. Stick with this, it's complicated. Earlier in the year, the Minister for Islamic Affairs had come under some extreme scrutiny when it was found his state-sanctioned print run of the Quran contained errors and misprints. He was accused of doing it on purpose to try to discredit the Muslim faith. BBC News reported that in response, the government descended into turmoil, and Sheikh Jaber al-Ahmad al-Sabah responded by dissolving parliament and calling for elections. A report by the Inter-Parliamentary Union says it was those elections that gave liberal candidates the chance to step forward. Liberal and Islamist candidates took a staggering amount of seats and immediately started leaning on reforms that would advance women's rights and move towards stopping political corruption and public funds mismanagement. Amid all the turmoil, women got the vote for good in 2005, and it all started because someone couldn't be bothered to give the state-sanctioned version of the Quran another read-through before publishing it. The bad planning of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The French Revolution was a bloody period in France's past, where unrest led to a lot of practicing with a guillotine. King Louis XVI took a final trip there in 1793. Marie Antoinette followed a few months later, and France changed forever. Their deaths kicked off the Reign of Terror and led to thousands of executions and the rise of Napoleon. But here's the thing, they didn't need to die at all, and probably wouldn't have if Louis XVI hadn't made a whole series of dumb decisions. The Smithsonian says it started when thousands of people stormed the Bastille in July 1789 for weapons. In October, they captured the royals and escorted them to Tuileries. But here's the important part, they weren't locked up. Louis and Marie Antoinette both could have walked out the door anytime, but they didn't. It wasn't until around 2 years later they finally snuck out, but they planned their escape pretty impractically. They traveled together in a large, conspicuous wagon, laden with things like a complete dinner service and wine chest, and Louis sent away the one person who probably could have helped them, his wife's lover, Count Axel Fersen. Not surprisingly, the royals were captured and escorted back to Tuileries after being easily recognized along the way. They had poor disguises and a penchant for socializing. Then, Fersen organized an escape with help from Sweden's king, broke into the palace and hung out with Marie for a day until Louis sent him away again. Following some other ups and downs, the king was sent to the guillotine about a year later. That's all for today. Subscribe to our channel for more fun videos.